Well, welcome to part 2 of my video regarding talking about drivers. Just a quick reminder of the challenge I'd set myself. So talking about drivers, but not allowed any planning, no research being involved, just me talking. So what could possibly go wrong there then? Bear in mind, some of what I'm talking about is possibly from things I may have read over 20 years ago, so don't quote me on anything that I'm actually saying in this. Thank you very much anyway, hope you enjoy watching. Onto the 90s, and very much a continuation, at least at the start of the 90s, from obviously following on to the 80s. So you still had your Prost versus Senna, Senna versus Prost, both versus Mansell kind of mix. Being British, I suppose I should like cheer for Nigel, but obviously a lot of people did it at the time. But I was more interested by early 1991 on the arrival on the scene of a certain German. Because, growing up as a kid, and when you're a kid, years seem to last forever. So for eternity, to me, it had been like Prost, Senna, Mansell, Piquet. It's kind of the same as how kids today, sort of growing up, well, it was all Vettel, it was all Hamilton or whatever. And then Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc come in and take it to, the established drivers. That was how I felt when Michael turned up and started racing Senna and racing for position and fighting for wins and stuff. I'd watched Formula One for years. I liked Formula One. I liked the cars. The drivers were interesting, fun, or whatever. But Michael, to me, was the point when it moved on again. It almost got stale a little bit. The same drivers winning all the time, the same two teams winning all the time. And then, someone came along and something happened. So Benetton, Ferrari, so nothing against Williams and McLaren. I respect them massively as teams, but it was so nice and refreshing when someone else won. It just was, which might seem strange to younger people watching this, but when I was growing up, it was absolute McLaren and Williams ruling everything. That was, it's like if a Ferrari won or a Benetton won, it was like happy freaking days. Because despite being a Ferrari fan, I like the underdog. And it might seem strange for other people to think of Ferrari as being the underdog, but when I was watching racing years ago, they were. They were them winning was such a rarity. It was almost like it was an absolute relief when they did. Strangely. And now look at it. I know. But that sort of signalled the start of the new generation coming through to me, Michael turning up anyway. I mean, obviously you still had Mansell winning this title in 1992, you still had Prost winning it in 1993, and then the horror show, which was the 1994 season, where, you had the deaths, and you had controversy, and you had pit lane fires, and you had... It's just like that year threw everything at it. Respect to Damon Hill massively for the job he did at Williams, getting that team back on focused and on track with everything they had to go through. While I might not think he's necessarily the best driver in the world, the situation weirdly mirrored that with his dad after Jim Clark had died at Lotus, having to try and get the team round to, okay, we're still here, we can still do this. Let's do this, and for them or what have you. Again, Mike Hawthorne, Ferrari, and Peter Collins died. Another example of that to a certain extent. He didn't want to be racing at all, but it was like that was the one last thing he wanted to do, and Enzo was talking about giving up altogether. And Mike was, apparently, obviously because I wasn't there, sort of said to him, "No, look, we have to keep doing this now. Until we've won, we have to keep doing this." And it's a similar thing with Damon, I think. I don't know. I met him for all of 2 seconds, so I've never exactly spoke to him about it. But from what I've read, that's my understanding. So moving on to the mid-90s, obviously you've then got the epic almost battle between Michael Schumacher and Williams. Jumping past 94, because that's been covered so much. 95. Michael hitting his stride, the Benetton being a very competitive package. Then moving to Ferrari. This will sound strange, obviously, because I'm waxing lyrical about Michael, but during the next couple of years, my favourite driver at Ferrari was actually Eddie Irvine. Just because, whereas Michael was a consummate professional, consummate winning machine, consummate drive, focus, Eddie was almost the light relief to that, I mean, obviously, professional racing drivers still wanted to go out and win, do his best or whatever else. But there was a more I love Michael for what he did in the car and the professionalism, but Eddie I just found a little bit more interesting as a character almost. I mean, the sort of boy with Mika Hakkinen, for example. Obviously, I'm a Ferrari fan. He was the guy we had to beat. He was super fast, but I'd never, while he was racing, could get engaged with his character because he was kind of the quiet Finn, we talk about Raikkonen being monosyllabic and whatever else, and Hakkinen was a bit flat and whatever else. It's only since he's finished racing, and I see him in interviews now, or people talking to him or whatever else, you get a little bit more of his personality and the dry humour and the wry smiles and stuff. And, now it's sort of like if I had to spend a day around Mika Hakkinen or Eddie Irvine, I would be Hakkinen, no question, because I kind of get the feeling I'd be wanting to Eddie on the television and at a distance, kind of interesting, fun to watch. I get the feeling in day to day trying to handle him, it'd be a complete nightmare. But I could be wrong. And he might have changed in the 25 odd years that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, the 90s started off with some massive, massive characters. And when Mansell left the sport, when Prost left the sport and Piquet dropped out of the sport, when Berger eventually sort of slid off out of the sport, I haven't mentioned Ayrton because he should have been in the sport for so much longer than he was. But when they ended up out of the sport, there was almost like a vacuum in terms of the big names and the personalities and whatever else. And Damon, for me, never really filled that. No disrespect to him, because obviously he had a good career. Jacques Villeneuve was not his father. In fairness, I don't think he ever tried to be. David Coulthard, from everything I've read, I mean, I've read his autobiography, I've read Mark Priestley's book, The Mechanic, and everything I've heard, or what my understanding of David Coulthard is he's very much a proper gentleman, almost like he was in the wrong decade of racing and he should have been racing in the 50s or something, genuinely good guy. And people have a lot of respect for him. I mean, David Coulthard sort of said himself, there were a lot of faster guys out there, but he had a 13-year career at the top, because basically people knew that he was hardworking. He was consummate professional, and you can, if you have a reputation for that being that way, you can, not cruise on it, because otherwise you'll lose that reputation, but it will see you get noticed. Your name will be going into the good books. You'll be on like F1 Santa's good list. So whilst again I don't think David was necessarily the quickest guy out there, he'll tell you himself from what I've read that he isn't. But very, very solid, very dependable driver. And from what I can work out, a good guy as well. Yeah. So leaving into the late 90s, as I said, you've got not so many big names. There's guys there, there's the Rubens Barrichellos of the world, and they always say about his career, his problem was he spent too long at teams like the Jordans or the Stewarts of this world, and it took him too long to get into the big seats. So sort of by that point, he had been like what we consider now to be a good midfield driver. And by the time he got in Ferrari, basically the roles were almost set. He'd have had a difficult time proving himself. This is going into the 2000s now, basically, but where they talk about, him being designated number 2, contract saying number 2 or whatever else. The fact of the matter is, even if the contract had said nothing of the sort, it was Michael's team, it was car designed for Michael or whatever else to the things he liked. Michael did the balance of the testing and a lot of, the conversations or whatever else. He was such a huge integral part of that team. Anyone coming in would have struggled. So, I never think of Rubens as being even close to Michael. But the fact of the matter is, he probably was a lot closer than it looked on paper. No fault of his own. But I'm getting ahead of myself now, so we'll call it over with for the 90s. Yeah. So going into the 2000s, you had Ferrari's massive period of dominance, and obviously, Ferrari fan, like Michael, like Rubens as well for that matter. No problem with this at all. But it is to see some racing occasionally, and Kimi, Juan Pablo Montoya, and Fernando Alonso, seeing that generation starting to come through, seeing then when they had the cars available to them, taking the fights to the Ferraris, that was enjoyable stuff. As much as I like seeing a Ferrari win, I like seeing a race. And, they managed to do that, and on their day they were able to do that, and that was good. But it's like Ferrari at the time very much doing the thing that Mercedes have been doing the last few years, of having all the ingredients in place, doing their homework, doing a solid job. What I think undone them in the end is basically tyres, ironically. If it hadn't been for the tyre war, and they could have continued on with the set knowledge and the set understanding, going into 2005, for example, they wouldn't have been caught so completely out. Because Ferrari, I don't know how much Michael had to do with this strategy or not. Basically, the previous few years have been running this thing of running sprint sessions basically in the races, just going quickly as possible, pit stop, quickly as possible, pit stop, quickly as possible, pit stop. And the tyres they've been using had basically been designed with that concept in mind. So come the 2005 season, when they got to run through the whole year with using the same set of tyres, they just came completely unstuck. Because Bridgestone had got pretty sure it was Bridgestone, but no data and no understanding of how to make the tyres last for any length in terms of stretch. And so they were massively disadvantaged, which is why the only win they had that year, of course, was the USGP. But but it did show the rising up of the next generation, which was good. You know, Kimi and Fernando finally coming of age. And then, of course, following hot on their heels, just as they're like, yes, we've got to the top, we can do this, we're going to win our championships. Earlham comes out as Hamilton, and Jenson Button's also in the mix going around. You know, it's like any point they get good, you know, Jenson gets a good car, you know, he's racing right at the top. When Lewis, obviously, he won his title, he nearly won in his debut year. Fair play to him. And then you've got Seb coming up as well, and he gets in the Red Bull just to the point the Red Bull gets good. And, you know, he's starting to challenge as well. So you've got a younger generation coming in at the start of the decade and a younger generation coming in at the end of the decade. And overlap there. I mean, Kimi's still racing. Fernando's not been gone that long from F1 and still been competing in other things. So it's I would say it was a stronger grid and a stronger generation than the previous decade on balance. You know, the 90s, the end of the 90s, mid to end of the 90s, you had some strong top guys, but the generation that turned up next, for me, were stronger still as an average, you know. It's always hard to tell with Kimi, sort of like almost which Kimi turns up, which sounds harsh, but the problem is I think he's as interested, or he comes across as being interested as the people are listening to him almost. So one of the things that is sort of like when when he went to Ferrari, it was like Ferrari, what they were after was another Michael. They wanted someone to pick the team up, talk to them, everyone get it together as a unit. And what basically happened was that Massa had obviously been there another season, he was more integrated into the team, he had his own way of working, he wanted this, he'd tell people about it. And if he didn't get it, he'd tell people about it. And if he didn't get it, he'd tell people about it. And he'd be talking with the team and into the team and as part of the team to try and get it. Whereas my understanding is with Kimi, basically he'd ask for something he wanted once. And I think it was 2009 eventually, the tail end of that season, when obviously Felipe, after Felipe had his accident, Kimi get more out of a handle on the car. The team turned around to him and sort of said, well, why haven't you been speaking to us about this and this before? And Kimi's response was just sort of like, I did. But as far as he was concerned, from my understanding at least, and what I've read or what I've in interviews or in magazines or whatever, as far as Kimi was concerned, he had mentioned it, therefore that was almost like his responsibility over with, and it was up to the team whether they then listened to him or not. And if they didn't, that wasn't his fault. Whereas other drivers are more, you know, if they're not getting their way, they're going to work at it and going to keep working at it until they do get their own way or noticed or what have you. But yeah, it's that thing is, if in retrospect you look at the list of drivers that came through between 2000 and 2010, it's a stellar list. It just is. I mean, we talk about, in general, the grids have gotten stronger year on year on year. Because you look back to the 90s, I mean, we talk about pay drivers now in terms of like Lance Stroll and Nicholas Latifi and stuff. Those guys are almost godlike compared to some of the people who rocked up in tail end grids at the start of the early 90s. They just are. I mean, there's a reason super license points exist, you know. It's like anyone, if they get on the F1 grid now, is a good driver. Right, by any standard, to get the super license points required to be an F1, you have to be a good driver. You don't get them by accident. They're not handed out in box cornflakes. So, we've discussed Kimi, we've loosely touched on Fernando. I don't necessarily want to get too into depth on him at the moment. And obviously the next generation which will be coming through as well, like Lewis and Seb. But I'm going to move on to the final decade now, 2010 to 2020. So, 2010s. You have Fernando coming over to Ferrari. I'm never sure how I felt about that, because sort of felt like with Fernando earlier on in his career when he was in his Renault days or whatever, the young exciting driver coming through. I don't know if there wasn't the need for the politics or whether because they were chasing a target and it was under Flavio Briatore, his manager, so it was all in-house to a certain extent, and a kind of young team back on the rise, so all working together to improve the young team on the rise, as it was seen at the time almost. I don't know whether you necessarily saw some of the stuff you saw later on in his career, but it's like when he went to McLaren, I think he got the short end of the stick to a certain extent and blamed for various things that it wasn't just him. I think it was a group thing. Some of it were misunderstandings, which in heightened tension just all blew up anyway. So I don't want to put the fault for 2007 entirely at his door, but he didn't help. And then going to Renault and getting frustrated there. Then moving on to Ferrari, and I was just like, oh god, it's just going to be like the Fernando Alonso team. And a lot of the events of 2010 didn't really do a lot to sort of this has got pointed out to me in the past, I think there's a thing in Ferrari documentary I watched where Marquis di Portago was talking about Enzo Ferrari, and he was saying that he'd sat down and was having dinner with Enzo once, and Enzo basically said that the reason he loved the cars so much and not the drivers is because cars are loyal. Any driver, if they're offered a contract or a better car by another team, will go to that team. And with Fernando, as much as he confessed that I love Ferrari, I love whatever else, I want to be with this team. And the same with him, I always feel at any other teams, like with his recent thing with Toyota or whatever, or whenever he does his IndyCar things, he's not there because he necessarily gives two hoots about the team or the series as how it feels. It's what can it do for Fernando. But racing drivers have to be selfish from the point of view of their career, I suppose. And, I don't know Fernando. It might be entirely different to that, but it's the way it comes across sometimes, rightly or wrongly. But that could be dodgy press. As I said, not exactly like I know him personally. So, benefit of the doubt. 2010 didn't do a lot to dissuade me of that point of view. Meanwhile, Seb, of course, we're going into 2011, is winning everything. And I liked Seb when he first turned up on the scene, young driver, enthusiastic or whatever else. I remember him crashing, I think it was the start of 2009, with Robert Kubica in Australia, and then finding him out afterwards to go and apologise to him, which I thought was very humble and whatever. And it's like, as he won more races and won more races and won more races, and the bitterness and whatever else that started creeping in between him and Mark Webber, I don't know, the Seb I liked when he wasn't winning, that didn't come across to me anymore. It could just be that I was bored of him winning, because obviously when it's not your guys winning, it's very easy to get frustrated when there's someone else doing it all the time. So it's a similar thing with Lewis, really. I've been watching his career on and off since 1996 when he first appeared on television in a series called McLaren Champions of the Future, which was about karting. And he was incredibly good in that. He was the guy that stood out. Other people in it, I'm pretty sure, were like Paul di Resta, Susie Stoddard, as she was then. Um, I think I just missed the few years before when it had been like the likes of Jenson Button and Anthony Davidson and that generation had sort of skipped out by that point. But it was a good crew of young, hopeful future prospects. But Lewis was the one that I remembered. Um, so I kept basically ear out, and I remember hearing about him in Formula Renault, and I remember hearing about him in British F3, and then European F3, and then obviously you've got 2006, and you've got the GP2 championship as it was, which he then won, and it's like, well, what do you do with your GP2 champion? If you've got the seat, you stick them in it, and McLaren did, and the rest is history. So I was really happy for him getting the F1 drive, having watched his journey and his progression through the series and what have you. And it's never been a case of that I particularly dislike Lewis. I don't. I don't necessarily, outside of the sport, I don't necessarily share his interests in terms of his type of music or his style or anything else. But that isn't a reason in itself to dislike someone, I think it has just become that the constant winning. It'd be nice to see someone else win, you know. But that's not his fault. That's just the way the sport has gone. And obviously, his first number one task is to win. That's what he does. He's a racing driver. That's his job. In fairness, I'm pretty sure that's what he enjoys doing. He's not exactly going to stop because other people are bored of it, So we're getting through into this decade now. It's interesting to see some of the midfield grid, It's like Sergio was on the Ferrari string, got a shot at McLaren just at the wrong time. And I thought he ran quite impressively against Jenson, all things considered. Jenson was an established guy at the team. He was, the former world champion. So for Sergio to go there and do as well as he did, I thought was actually quite impressive. I thought he was really hard done by and had deserved us another season there. But that's how it goes, unfortunately. I think if he had another year there and the car had been half decent, the story of Sergio Perez could have been completely different. As a character, he's sometimes a bit difficult to warm to, perhaps. But then it might just be just because the way he comes across in this country, In more Latin countries, maybe the tale of Sergio is considered slightly differently. There's the Red Bull Juniors. Ricardo is a good product from there, I think. As a personality, he's very engaging, very fun, and he gets people interested in the sport. Obviously, you've got Lando as well, who's now come in and he's doing a very similar thing and attracting more people to it, and that's always good to see because it could be the best sport in the world, but if nobody wants to watch it or nobody cares, it's not gonna last very long. You always need to attract fresh blood and fresh people to it, and that's something that the likes of Daniel Ricciardo, Lando Norris do very well. Obviously Charles Leclerc as well, and Max Verstappen. Those two, as I was saying earlier about how I like Michael Schumacher versus the established drivers, those two are like a breath of fresh air, almost coming in and racing and hunting down and trying to wheel to wheel. I mean, Monza, whether even before that, the pair of them against each other at Silverstone, that was fantastic to watch. Austria, the hunting down, will Verstappen get him or whatever. I think if the rules after Austria that were in place had been in place at Austria, that scenario would have played out very differently. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still think Max would have got him because he just had superior car performance at that point in the race, and he drove an outstanding race. Credit where it's due. But I think he'd have had to work harder for it. If you look after that, Silverstone, that was awesome. The absolute war at Monza. I mean, Mercedes boys doing everything in their power to try and get past Charles and just not quite managing it. That was brilliant. I'm not just saying that as a Ferrari fan, I'm saying that as a motor racing fan. That was brilliant to watch. But this is what I mean, is, you've had a good generation in the previous decade. Between 2010 and 2020, there were some good people coming through, like Daniel Ricciardo, like Max Verstappen, or whatever else, credit where it's due to the Red Bull Academy at that point. The one that got away, Gilles Bianchi, I think he would almost certainly have been in the Ferrari instead of Kimi, I suspect, probably a couple of seasons ago. Sadly. And it's almost a sort of poetry that Charles has got the drive. It's like the closing off of the circle almost. If he wins the championship, it'll still almost be like Jules winning it in some weird kind of way. I've been talking forever now. Probably this may end up being in 2 videos perhaps, because I may have got carried away, which, when I'm let loose talking about Formula One, this is always a bit of a danger. So, I mean, so many drivers throughout the history of the sport I loved. Gilles aside, it's very difficult for me to make a list or give a definitive answer as to who I liked and what and when. My current favourite driver, by the way, is Charles Leclerc. I've been following his career since 2016, 2015 actually, from European Formula 3. So, yeah, all the hard work, all the sacrifice, all the bad luck and tragedy he's had, it's a compelling story. But the thing is, when you look at him and you look at Max and you look at Lando and George Russell, of course, from the Mercedes link, Alex Albon, we've yet to see the best of him, I think. Esteban, maybe. But there's so much talent coming through, and the F2 and F3 fields are stacked. So, and then you've got the growth of Formula E as well. So, at some point, maybe you might see drivers coming from there back to Formula One or something. Weirdly, I think Gasly's possibly done that. Not intentionally. But, Mercedes do wax lyrically about Stoffel. So, all things are possible. But I think where I'm going with this is, whatever happens in the future of the sport in terms of the cars, the rules, the regulations, or whatever, on the driver front, the future is looking very bright, and that's only going to be a good thing. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I will call it a day now, because it's turned into something it wasn't really meant to be, I think. And if you've enjoyed the video and me rambling, it's not always quite this out of control. This was meant to be entirely scripted and just off the top of my head, and it's definitely been that. But if you'd like to subscribe, please do. If you want to give it a like, that would be great. If you want to comment on it, fantastic. I'll see you in the comments. But bye bye for now.